Okay, well, let's get started. Welcome to our second session on student success in systems engineering. I'm Dr. Stephen Conrad. I'm a new faculty here at systems engineering, associate professor, just started in January. And a lot of my research focuses on coupled systems modeling, which means I dive into the sort of engineering aspects as well as the social and behavioral aspects. And so a lot of what I do involves quite a bit of writing. And so today I wanted to sort of share some of my observations about academic writing, some of the expectations I've learned, as well as some of my transition journey and some pointers for there. So just to give everybody a second to read the comic. It's one of my favorite ones. You can see Edward, who is practicing good academic writing. You know, punctuation is important. You know, legibility is important. It may not be how he rolls on the street, but it's definitely excellent there. So with academic writing, we're really looking to find a bit of balance between legibility, clarity, and style. I'm going to bring back style a little bit because I think academic writing should have style in it. So just real quickly, I want to thank Dr. Miller for setting this off last week, or a couple weeks ago, excuse me. She actually introduced writing a little bit, the concept of writing, and I appreciate that, as well as remind everyone of our upcoming sessions. So in 2 weeks, I'll also be diving into writing, but more intensive elements focused on specific PhD writing, how to get your PhD writing done, how can you set up a journey, what kind of success might you and practice you might have for that PhD element of your program. And then Dr. Bradley will finish off the session with what is systems engineering. So if you don't have those on your calendar yet, I invite you to please do put them on there. And if you're in Fort Collins, to join us beforehand for lunch and social time. So definitely good. I'm learning about the sandwiches here. The vegetarian sandwich may not be that great today, but the ham sandwich is pretty good. And then if you just throw salsa on it, everything is wonderful. Okay, so briefly what I want to sort of talk about or share today is, what are some of those expectations of academic writing? Like what are the elements that set apart academic writing from other types of writing, like some of these elements? Then I want to talk a bit about one key element that some of our students struggle with, sort of transitioning from other types of writing to academic writing. So if you've had experience with writing in the professional realm or industry realm, or even the government realm, like if you have this different element and you're transitioning from that realm to academia, what are some pointers and things to look out for? And I'll sort of share my own personal journey on that. And then I'll just sort of end off with some resources and tools that you can use to continue exploration, and then questions and answers. So this talk is really the sort of start for your academic writing elements. I'm not going to dive, in 45 minutes, dive in and have all the answers today. This is, if you've started already, you're getting into academic writing, or if you've been in academic writing for a while, maybe you have some new pointers and some new elements that I'll bring up. But ultimately, what we're trying to find as academic writers is a bit of a balance between how do we think about our writing before we start versus diving right into it. So this illustration sort of said, how do you write? You just start randomly typing words on a piece of paper and then find out that the way you approached it was maybe the wrong direction, or do you spend hours and hours just thinking about it? And hopefully after today, I'll give some pointers for you to start thinking about what's needed for academic writing, so you can think about it a little bit more, but still encourage everybody to dive in and practice. That's really how you become a good academic writer, is through practice and through that. So what's academic writing? What exactly is it? Well, one thing I want to make a point about academic writing is, well, it's writing, but it's really a new culture. It's it's a new language. It's a new element. It's not just a change in style. You're not just using different words or putting paragraphs in different order. Academic writing is a bit of a culture that you're joining, and it has its own expectations and criteria that go along with it. Now, how did I learn academic writing myself? I would say I learned it the hard way, which means I found out what was wrong over and over again, and eventually learned, what were the expectations, what were the cultural expectations. And I would say, as educators, we don't always necessarily do the best job of trying to teach, those expectations and that cultural aspects of academia. So this session is trying to expose a little bit of those expectations, a little bit of what the culture is around academia, so that nobody has to get the piano. Maybe although I'm not really sure what's in the small case, but I'm not big on that one either. Okay. So what are some expectations of academic writers? Well, a lot of the expectations of writing align with similar expectations of just being a good researcher, being a good academic. So the writing needs to express your capacity for critical thinking, right? You're really working through this through an argument. You're expressing your knowledge. You're expressing how you're taking ideas, and you're using what you learn, being critical to those, and then sharing and contributing, right? So that's what you're expected as a student to do. You're expected that as a researcher, and you're expected with that. One thing though about academic writing is there is another sort of underlying expectation, and this is one of the things I found a hard way after getting some rejections or just getting feedback, is there's an expectation that you're bringing in the broader academic environment with you on your journey. So you're expected to identify the history, really the sources, what has already been done in the study of what you're looking at, and then look for where you're contributing to that history, and you're building on the broader academic community, right? So academic writing is all about stepping stones. It's about taking it out there, and you're showing and illustrating how you're contributing to that, right? So your literature review, your introduction paragraphs isn't really, it's more than just here's what's there. It's about really how you're transitioning and what you're contributing to that, right? And so that's a bit of a kind of a unique thing about an academic writer that you might not see in other types of writing, where it's all about you. It's all about what you're contributing with this paper. You want to bring in and show your participation in that broader community. So other expectations, you're expected to describe what you did, right? You're expected to describe your methods that you use in the work. You're supposed to be clear in that. You're supposed to present your data and your information, in a manner that's, if you have your methods and your data together, it's repeatable. Somebody could just do the experiment or do the study again, or come to similar conclusions perhaps with that. You're supposed to analyze your data in an unbiased manner. So your observations about your findings in academic writing should be free of bias. That doesn't mean you can't bring in your opinions or bring in your thoughts about your data, but in the presentation and the analysis of that data, it should be unbiased. And so that's the sort of the sixth expectation is while you present your information in an unbiased way, you're expected now to show that you're an expertise. You have some expertise in that area. So you're also expected to rigorously defend any conclusions that you come up with that are well-founded, right? And so part of academic writing is interacting with reviewers and interacting with other peers and other, if you publish a journal article, for example, you'll get feedback from reviewers, and your job is to defend your conclusions to the reviewers or defend yourself to other people, right? So while, and it's a little bit different than maybe, other types of writing where you might have a comment and you're required to change that comment or adapt it because somebody paid you to write this report. In academic writing, your expectation is to defend yourself. Okay, so with that, you're expected to express your expertise in a neutral manner, meaning, well, I'll talk a little bit more about neutral manner, but you're expressing your research to the broader community. You're trying to be neutral and understanding and respectful of other people's findings and other people who are doing similar work in your area. And so I'll talk a little bit about the neutrality, but that's another expectation. And then I had sort of an eighth one, which is one of my favorite speakers is Randy Olson, who gives a talk about don't be such a scientist, right? Because often academic writing can be a little bit boring. I'll admit it can be a little bit structural. It'd be like, right? And so, I sort of add to this expectation that we should also be creative in how we do this, right? We should be able to tell our story, be creative in the story, but it does need to be grounded in literature. We can't just make something up. It has to be grounded in literature. And so on that literature note, there's one kind of underlying expectation that is in all academic writing is that anything that you express, all statements, all factual statements, need to be supported in some way. And so that could be either with a reference, or it could be with your own data, but those factual statements have to have some degree of support. They can't just be hanging out there in academic writing. They have to sort of show that. And so sometimes you just have to repeat that reference quite a bit. And Dr. Miller last week talked about referencing and citations. And so you can't just throw your reference in at the end, like you might do on some professional reports and say, this helped me, and this is the reference. Every factual statement, whether it's in one sentence or two sentences or three sentences, has to have that support and that link between the factual statement and that support. Okay, so let me dive into some of the key elements. So those were some expectations of what it is to be an academic writer. What are some of the key elements of academic writing? One of the elements is that with academic writing, you have a different audience. And it's recommend you be aware of that audience. And what this means is that your academic audience has knowledge about what you're writing about. And so you're not necessarily a standalone expert. You're contributing to the academic community. You're contributing to this, whether it's an assignment for your professor or your own publication. Your audience knows what you're talking about. And so you need to be aware of that's a bit of more of a dialogue and an interaction with that audience than a one-off paper. Other elements of academic writing, there's always an argumentative feel to it. You're presenting facts, you're presenting history, gaps in research, you're presenting rationale about why your contribution is important, and you're really demonstrating this use. So you're presenting your point of view and you're demonstrating facts and data, research, literature, investigations, meta-analysis, whatever was done in order to support your conclusions. That's an argumentative purpose, right? You're arguing. That means you have to have this continuous feel of pros and cons of really your whole paper and your statements that you make. So let's say, for example, I'm doing a paper on rational choice theory, and rational choice theory is exactly what I need to do, and this is wonderful, I did this, I used rational choice theory, these are my findings. I'm still expected to talk about some of the limitations of that, to still be argumentative and be aware of that viewpoint. So, the pros of that is that it provided this data. The cons is it's limited within bounded rationality or whatever sits, right? So that argumentative purpose is underlying academic writing. And then I sort of talked a little bit on that when I said about the culture and contributing, but academic writing is presenting problems within that existing knowledge. And so within your academic writing, you want to bring in that existing knowledge, you want to create connection with your contribution to that knowledge, and you want to present that rationale. Why should you even consider reading what I'm about to tell you, or what that rationale is? And so for those that have submitted for a review or peer review, often that may be one of the comments that come back from a peer reviewer is, I don't get why this is done. Like, why did you do this study? This is really interesting, but I don't see the point of this, right? And you might go, oh man, that's really hurtful. Like, what do you mean you didn't see the point of my last 4 years of work? And somebody now comes back and says, I don't even get it. It's likely because you just didn't have a present the rationale existing with the current literature, or finding that contribution point within that area. Okay. So let me sort of share my personal journey of becoming indoctrinated into the academic writing realm. And I really kind of call this a tale of multiple voices. So as many of us who had come from industry, or maybe you started your academic career, you're still doing other things, or maybe you dive right into academia, you are using multiple versions of language in our communication. Right? We're constantly needing to balance the way we speak with our peers outside of school, within school, within classes, within the professional environment, within our family. We get these multiple voices. So what happened with me when I started my PhD, I had these multiple voices on how I should write and the expectations of what I was supposed to write. So I was writing, multiple professional, I was doing professional research. I was doing research within the professional and industry world, but my research reports were written in a different manner than an academic report, or my technical summary reports were written in a different manner. So everything I was sort of writing within this professional realm was a little bit different. And it's just sort of highlight, right? So in the professional, I was supposed to be writing to communicate and influence and opinions and actions, right? This is, somebody hired me to design something. This is the design that I presented, and you should use this design because this is what you paid me to do. So this is great, right? So that's sort of what I was doing. Whereas in academia, it's really, we're using analysis to increase understanding. We're not supposed to be influencing or, influence in a sense that we want you to do this now. Within a typical academic writing, there's always gray areas within writing. There's, opinion papers and things like that that you can get into. But for the most part, so that was a bit of a different approach. That was, supposed to be a bit more neutral in that. Professional, I was supposed to focus on facts, leaving my opinions out. This is what I did. This is what was found. So therefore, pay me more money, and I'll do it again, or something like that. And whereas in academia, we're looking for that, for you to add your opinions and for you to add, link ideas and to work through that. So it's more than just facts. It's that linkage of ideas and expressing your expertise. In professional, I was also encouraged to be precise and to the point, just use bullets, something like that. Whereas, in academia, I was really kind of encouraged, and we're encouraged to hedge our opinions. So we might add verbiage to the language we use so that we're being more respectful. And I'll talk about hedging in a minute. A lot of professional was informal, necessarily that have this real strict formal language, where academia has a very formal structure to it that you follow. Professional, I used to use first person. I did this, we did this all the time. Used to do that a little bit in academia, but we also add that third person view. So a third person could be, this study or our research team, or, like we're really looking to a different viewpoint. So we're needing to interweave, I did this with we did this, and this paper does this, right? This type of thing. So I was kind of struggling with this a little bit, and I'll share some examples of where I did not succeed initially, and then hopefully where I got a little bit better. But let's jump into the first element I was talking about, informality versus formality. And when we're sort of, as an academic writer, we're expected to transition between the multiple voices that we may have. So we're expected to transition and put our academic writer, hat on when we're producing this document within the academic realm, and leave behind these informal or professional voices that we may have, right? So in informal, we might say something like, I don't believe the results are accurate. Or we might say, I suppose the research indicates this, or he's short, he's tall, or something like that. Informal. In academic writing, we have to be very formal about the way we express these statements. And so it's, the results are not believed to be accurate, right? More neutral. Or the results indicates, or suggests is actually a better term there. Indicates is good, suggests is good. And when you make statements like he's short, you have to say very specifically what is that statement. So he's 5'6". So we don't leave out the whether it's short or not. In the professional realm, I might make a very direct statement. Experiment X gave the best results. That's probably true. So we were hired to do that, need to do that. But within the formal academic realm, we would express that slightly different within the context of the broader research community. So, the findings from experiment X appear to, suggest that the treatment applied provides notable results. And so that, there you're sort of taking into consideration that there may be knowledge out there that would contradict you. There may be other studies that would contradict you or other findings. So you are saying that this is exactly what you found, but you're being you're hedging that a little bit more. So you likely have come across hedging quite a bit. I'm sure you could sit down with an academic, and any of the professors and talk about hedging and say, I like hedging, I don't like hedging, but it's sort of a cultural aspect of academic writing. and so hedging is used to express really our caution. We're trying to be prudent and we're trying to be respectful of the research that could be out there or the literature that could be out there, distinguish between our claims that we have versus real true facts, right? And so we're trying to hedge that. We're just really helping to express that we're hesitant and we're embracing uncertainty within the system, right? And so I gave a couple examples. One example just came to mind. Let's say you're the first person to ever do a particular study. You'd want to say that in your paper. You want to say, this is the first time that this ever happened. I'm really great. You wouldn't say that though in an academic paper. You would say, to my knowledge, this represents the most novel system that you have, in that. So you're recognizing, your limitations in that, but you're still trying to express that. So that's sort of hedging. Other examples of hedging, I just made up one real quick. You might have had no hedging. Johnson et al., 2005 found that 200 liters of Diet Coke results in a 20% weight loss over drinking sugar-based sodas. So yeah, Johnson, if you drink Diet Coke, that's awesome. But we would want to probably hedge that a little bit, because even though we did find this study, we're still recognizing that it's within a broader system. So Johnson et al. Suggests that substituting Diet Coke for sugar-based sodas may result in a 20% weight loss for those participant studies. So it's a little bit, you could maybe see it's a little bit nuanced that you see. There's lots of hedging words that I put up there, and it may sound wishy-washy, and but it really it's illustrating prudence on your part. You're recognizing that you're part of a broader community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about extremism. So extremism is one thing that I find in writers that are transitioning between different realms, is that we're maybe required to be extreme or be absolute in our statement in some type of writing. But within academic writing, it's more about that neutrality tone. You're trying to be more respectful. So you want to express everything with really medium certainty. Yeah, whether in your lab you're 100% certain, you still express it in the writing as medium certainty. And so you're trying to avoid extremism versus what you often be paid upon, right? So if you're paid, and I would say, I use the term paid because it's a bit of a contractual relationship with sometimes consulting work or professional work or industry work, versus, researchers, we do receive funding, but we're trying to be independent of that funding, right? So there's a little bit of a different connection there. So what do I mean by that? Yeah, Johnson and Sally, it is the best paper on behavioral modeling you can read. Everybody should go read it right now. So I might say that to my students. I might say that to my peers. But if I was going to write that down as part of my academic writing, I would say Johnson and Sally is one of the most cited papers, on behavioral modeling, right? And so I don't know if it's the best. Maybe it is. Maybe it's the worst actually, but it is one of the most cited, and therefore it's used quite a bit. So these examples of extreme language that are carried over from professional writing, and I carried over quite a bit in my early writing, just because it was a habit to do these things. Things like all, none, every, most, always, best, worst, things that we use in our normal vernaculum that we want to remove from our academic writing. So I'm actually, extremism is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. So I got another slide on it because everybody has their own particular pet peeve. I'm a terrible speller. So if you sent me a paper with horrible spelling, I would not even notice it. I would just read through it without a particular problem. But if you sent me, a paper and it had extremisms in it, they'll just pop out like this red light, right? And so the reason why I sort of stick on this is because of extremism really directs readers to a particular viewpoint or particular bias. What you're trying to say is that you believe with the very large certainty that this is exactly how it is. And that could set off reviewers quite a bit, especially if a reviewer has a conflicting paper or another academic or your professor knows this knowledge or this concept. That'll set off those little landmines. And so you want to avoid things like increasing evidence, right? Like, do you actually know if it's increasing? Like, did you measure it? Did you go out? Is there a metadata study that says that there was 20 papers in 2020 and there's now 29 papers in 2021, right? What does it mean to be increasing? Or things like overwhelming or vast. right? If you actually know a proportion, if it's 62% of the literature cited this, then you would say 62%. If you don't actually know, you just say majority, or something like that. But this overwhelming and vast might go through that. You want to avoid generalizations where you can, so it's things like throughout, or it's widely agreed, or it's generally agreed that, there are some theories out there that have been so popular and particular approaches that that's appropriate, right? But when you start, making a generalization like that, it better be a public knowledge type thing. It better be agreed upon within the realm of things like that. And other things like because academic writing is grounded in science, it's grounded in theory and engineering principles, it's really grounded in these underpinnings. Be careful when you use terms that are also grounded in science, things like independent or proportional or dependent. These have specific connotations, things like if this is dependent on something else, you're saying that there's a causal relationship between that. If it's independent, then you're also saying that there's no causal relationship. So you got to be careful with some of those types of words like that. And I left the extreme up there again. So that's a bit of an introduction. I'm going to take a lesson from Dr. Miller. I loved how she brought this up a couple weeks ago. And so I dug through, went back 13 years, and I found my integrated proposal paper, which is something that I had to do as part of my PhD. I had to propose and write a paper on a non-related subject to my PhD, and then defend that to my comprehensive committee as an illustration, right? So this was really kind of my first foray into intensive academic writing. And boy, did I learn a lot during that particular process. I mean, yeah, there was some cry sessions about that. And rightfully so. I was terrible. Oh man, I would look back to my writing at that particular point and I'm like, what was I talking about? I don't even know what's happening. So just some lessons. So this is my introduction paragraph to the paper with the first draft that I submitted and then the final draft that I submitted after going through this process. And, so over on the left, the organic food market, seen tremendous growth in recent years. It's growing to $40 billion, 2005, 120 countries. It's appropriately cited, good fact. Yeah, the market is growing at a rate of more than 20% annually. If it may continue, if additional food producers envision business opportunities in the market and consumer preferences shift towards organic and eco-labeled products. All right, another fact, but a bit of a supposition on my part. I'm already giving I'm giving a bit of an opinion right in the beginning. Change that. Alan Kovacs suggests, which I just threw suggest in there. That's the wrong plurality for that. It should be, it's referencing the paper, not to the people. So I did that wrong. That growth in the organic markets offers an opportunity to promote change. What's that? Oh, sorry, was there a question online? Okay, yeah, I'll come back to it if there. So I was attempting to try and transition from facts to like why you should read this paper at all. And then I just said something like, if so, at some point, the market may measurably affect the food chain if it is not already done. I don't even know what I was talking about there. It's like, I have no excuse. I mean, that should never even been written as a statement in this. So like introductions, again, I'm trying to bring my contribution to this paper, anything I'm writing, to the broader sense. And so now, if you look at the change, still using some of the same references, but interest in the organic foods is increasing worldwide. There's concerns about intensive agriculture, and food safety and food quality. Okay, so I'm giving the state of the system. This interest has spurred growth in the organic market as an alternative. So I'm giving, sort of a viable option to discuss later. Regenerative negative impacts, or the latter generating negative impacts that the former avoids. So I'm giving a bit of a response to the state. Organic farming practices promote an overall reduction in chemical food products and water, soil, and water systems. Studies have also suggested that organic diets may offer healthy food choices. So I'm giving some rationale or some reasoning that would say, oh, well, that sounds interesting. Maybe there's some solutions. And then, not surprisingly, these promises have encouraged strong consumer support and enticed governments to make investments in promoting organic foods. So so now instead of just giving just a bunch of facts and saying I'm going to do something, I've tried to create a state of the system, some responses, and then start to introduce the need for study. Okay. So I'll come back quickly to another thing I learned is knowing your audience. So one thing I found that moving from industry and professional realms to the academic realm is, boy, people have a lot of time, or at least they set across time to read these things, right? It's like they pay attention to what you write. So the busy professionalists, you're doing bullets, you're doing what you can really fast to get through things. You just want to look for the summary paragraph and you move on, right? You got all these other things going on. Yeah, you're in the academic realm, it's an expectation of this is a key, cultural aspect of the environment. So we set aside time to read these things, and we read these things and we think about these things, right? And so this is a fun little comic. Yeah, I wrote comments on the draft paper you sent me. I know it's not a reflection of you, but here it is. It's fully red and bleeding. Why? You probably want to see that in a professional realm. You might get some highlights or some things like that, but you have to know your audience, that when you finalize your papers and your writings and your submissions, someone's going to read it deeply and really look at what you write. So you have to give that same attention to your writing before you release it and let it go, because that's what will happen. Okay. So the other thing I learned about academic writing is it follows this linear structure. And it's, I don't know, I can always find it boring. Like I was a creative writer in college. So I wrote stories and I always tried to be really creative. And I get in trouble sometimes to be creative, and you'll see me doing comics and stuff. I'm always trying to introduce stories into academia. But you might find this boring, the structural approach relatively straightforward and boring, but it's ultimately necessary to provide clarity and to guide readers. So it means that simple things like all introductory paragraphs should be your thesis statement. What is this about? Subsequent paragraphs, should have topic statements that link back to your thesis. You need to give clues to transitions. You need to, the structure of the writing. Don't be afraid to clearly, expressively state what you're going to do. I am going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and after that I'm going to do this, and then finally this will be done. That you might think that's a bit sophomoric when you're trying to elevate your writing styles, or some of the writing styles we learned in high school, right? When you say, oh, be more creative in those phrase approach. But those are the things that guide the reader through this. And when you have an intensive reader and an intensive audience, they want to know what's happening. You don't want to have these assumptions. So yeah, feel free to be creative, but you're definitely guiding your reader. So let me turn back to my writing again for just a second. So this is my statement of purpose for my paper initially, and then the final one. And so in my integrated paper, I will assess whether current organic farming practice will have affected any measurable change in the food chain. That sounds exciting. Through either, I don't know, I was going to leave them guessing. I wasn't going to tell them what I was going to do. It's going to be, some of these things are going to happen in this paper. Altering agricultural systems and their effect on ecosystems, or through improving the quality of nutrients offered, right? So that's just wrong. And the last part should be in the methods anyways. I don't even want describing methods in my introduction. As part of my assessments, I will identify the differences between traditional food chain and the organic food chain. That sounds great. This whole next sentence should have been just thrown out. This will include this, and I'm going to do this. And relatively, that's again for methods, unrelated to really why I was going to do something. I anticipate that in my assessment, there will be areas in which organic farming may improve some aspects, but degrade others. A very leading statement. You're already saying what the conclusion of your paper is before I even got into it. So for instance, and then I'll back it up. I wanted the statement to be true. I'm going to back it up. So you know what's going to happen. For instance, while organic farming may reduce the volume of pesticides used, total crop output may change negatively. Well, it's not even linked to the topic. I'm talking about what I'm going to do in this paper, and now I'm talking about pesticides and other things. So in addition, unintended consequences such as insect, plant disease, outbreaks may occur from such practices. So if you were a reader and you read this as your outline for the story, somebody gave you a map for this paper, you might already be lost. You might be interested. Well, I agree with these kind of things, but it really doesn't give a good roadmap for what you're going to do. So change that. In this paper, I examine the hypothesis in a number of ways. So this was preceding some previous paragraph that explored that contribution, and then I presented a hypothesis of what I wanted to study. So first, I'll use a conceptual food system model to highlight critical components of the food system and outline the differences. I then provide analysis of the effects for agricultural ecology stemming from organic farming. Third, I evaluate the organic market against the theorem defining perfect markets and consider its shortcomings. I conclude by weighing the pros and cons of adopting organic farming as a policy goal and discussing the considerations that influence how this goal might be achieved. So if you're a reader, hopefully, you know what this paper is going to be about. Now you might go, I don't want to read this paper. That's fine. If it's not what you were expected to read. But if you think about when you're doing your research and studies, if your author presented that to you early on in your paper, that will save you a lot of time because you would automatically know that this is not appropriate for you or something like that. Okay. So other kind of, so don't be afraid to just say what you're going to do. Other little tricks and nuances you can do. Make sure you use conjunctions and transitions for reader cues. These are really great. A lot of times we leave these out, and our common vernacular, we don't talk to our significant others by, oh, honey, let's go to the mall and then let's shop here. Although if we were on the way, we might go this. However, if we we don't do that. But within writing, those are really, really good. I pulled out just a paragraph from a recent article of mine on conventional sewer systems. It didn't actually have a lot of reader cues in there, but you can sort of see, in the middle of the thing, we hold these estimates to be representative of potential, but conservative build-out costs. The estimates assume well-known and stable environmental conditions, and consequently, do not include additional complicating factors such as costs caused by landslides or inundations. In addition, we assume a stable economic and social political context, so on and so on, right? So bring those in. One of the references I'll give you has a nice table of the different types of transitional words and conjunctions that you can use. It's not expected that every single paragraph and line has these kind of conjunctions, but if you're transitioning your thought slightly, or if the reader might go askew somewhere, these are great little cues to guide them through the sentence. Okay, so some resources and tips just to round this off. Academic writing is about learning a new language and culture, right? So yeah, read. I'm sure everybody gets advice to read. That's just one of the great things you can do, because you're learning that expressive and cultural aspects of what it is to be academic writing. And there's look for the slight nuances between like a textbook and a journal article, or a conference paper, or a research proposal, anything within the academic realm. There's slight little nuances in how you express yourself. So immerse yourself in this writing, find models of papers or things that you're trying to write, and analyze how those authors present their ideas. I would love to say that, everyone in the academic realm is great writers. There's obviously nuances and things like that. I'm constantly working on trying to be a better writer myself. But you'll be able to pick up these things, so journal articles have gone through peer review and that kind of feedback. So, if you're writing an article on systems dynamic modeling, try to find some references. How did other authors present this information? So pick a journal that you might want to publish in, your research, or something that you're going to write in that's related, and study that style, right? So how do they say certain things? Like, how do they present common words? Are there certain expressions that are used in your discipline? So keep a list. Don't be afraid of keeping a list of this is the way things are said. I have like a Word document of commonly said certain things that express my knowledge of the topic, because that's how it's said within the community. And so we're humans are creatures of habit. So if we're reading through a paper and that phrase pops out, we're just going to ignore, and we're going to automatically assume that person knows what they're talking about. Because why? Because that's what we said. So it must be pretty good. So they could be either a reference to a type of methodological approach that you used, or a reference to like commonly cited journal articles, which is why we get some really great citation lists. So this emulation is showing your adaptation. You're adapting to the environment, the academic environment. But yeah, do remember still to use your own words. Like, so if you find something that's within a paper that expresses it in a way, you have to create your own way of saying that, so that it becomes your way of phrasing that, but it still really kind of it represents that context. I should probably put a, well, Dr. Miller had some good examples of doing that. Okay, other resources and tips. If you haven't already adopted a reference manager, start today. I don't really have a preference. Most reference managers, if you talk to anybody who uses it over time, will become popular, and then somebody buys them and they suck. So you just sort of pick whatever one works for you. But EndNote, Papers, RefWorks, Notera, Google Chrome, there's a whole number of them. But the idea is that you start, because you're looking for that literature backup, you're looking for that history, that expression of your knowledge and where you sit within your discipline. You need to create a database of that knowledge for yourself that you can bring into your papers and into your writing. Get feedback on your writing early. CSU has a great writing center where you can set up sessions with them, and they can help you work through this transition. They can help you with structure and style. You tell them what you're trying to write for, and they'll help you with that. There is a clearinghouse on writing and resource tips and tools and examples across all different styles, both internal academic writing as well as non-academic writing. So those are great references for you. And then I have a couple books that are available online at the CSU library. So one it's kind of a step-by-step guide for writing in academia, like how would you start pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing. So it doesn't really dive into those cultural aspects that I was talking about, or those expectations, but it's really good process diagram book. And the second is, I know it says social and behavioral sciences, and we're like, well, we're engineering here, but this book on successful academic writing actually is really good on terms of introducing the expectations of academic writing and talking about the cultural aspects that I mentioned, right? And so I use some of the learnings from there. These are both available online, so you can dive into them and take a look at those. Last little comment and suggestion I would do is get a style guide and stick with it, like look at it and read it and reference back to it quite a bit. One of the style guides I use is The Elements of Style by Schunk and White. And so, just sort of go back to say, how's my grammar style? How do I use parallelism? How do I use these different elements within writing? Have a good reference for that. This is a little bit, look for something that's more about the writing structure than the expectations of format. Like the MLA writing guide is a structural thing in terms of how you would format something. And you really want to look for something that speaks to you about paragraph structure and introductions and communication style. And why do you do that? Because just like I mentioned with certain things that pop out, everyone has grammar pet peeves. They're always fun when I find people who love my grammar mistakes and point them out to me. But there are little pet peeves. I have my own pet peeves. Things that always throw me off. The first thing that always throws me off is the use of this, followed by nothing. So every this has to have some kind of noun or subject. Like, what is this? So if you say, this implies that we must drive 40 miles per hour. What's this? I don't know. Sure, I can infer it because you just talked about the report or the study. But really, sentences should stand on their own. So that kind of pops out. As soon as I see that, this just pops out. It's like watching a science fiction movie. As soon as it pops out that it was filmed at Simon Fraser University, where I used to live in Vancouver, boom, I'm out of the movie, and I'm just sitting there. I'm like, oh, it's the education platform on that. So science fiction has been a bit destroyed with me living in a particular area in Canada. So that same thing happens. And so readers and reviewers will have those things pop out. That's why you want to pay attention to these style guides. Because just like you want to be an expert and defending your data and showing that your experiment was valid or your methods were valid, those same kind of little grammar mistakes will create questions in people's mind because they spend a lot of time. Okay. Other thing that pops out quite a bit is, for me, not calling out table and figures, or even not describing what the table and figure is fully. So if I'm reading something and there's a figure there and it looks great, it's got axis, it's got, you know, labels, I have no idea what it is, and nobody talked about it in the writing. So just boom, it popped up table and it moved on. Sure, I can infer that this must obviously be the table that they're talking about, but call it out. Table 3 illustrates this. Figure 4 documents that, right? You included it in your papers, so definitely call those out. And tables and figures should stand on their own. So your titles for figures and tables, excuse me, should, you know, this should illustrate what it is. This is a representation of the causal relationships between such and such. So if someone just saw that figure by itself, they would have that data. And the last little for me is lack of parallel structure. So look up parallel structure on your own, so you can kind of dive into that. But parallel structure is a way to help people follow patterns. And so you use the same method for writing a particular sentence with, you know, fact, structure, citation, fact, structure, citation. You're using those parallels throughout so that every time a reader goes through that structure, you see it. If it's random in a paper, it's just one of the things that drives me nuts. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, now it's here, it's there, we're there. Now, what are you talking about? So those little things to look at. So that's all I have. Love to open it up for questions and thoughts or other contributions by academic writers on the call that areas that I missed. Thanks very much. Ah, we got one little chat. So I'm gonna. Okay. Oh, Catherine, she's being good about telling everybody where they can get the chats and audio. Yeah, all right, let's get out of here. Okay, so questions? Yes.
You mentioned conservative literature, you are looking for your prizing. How does that sort of work its way in? I mean, does it work for or against you, or what's the influence of that in academic writing?
Yeah, so the way that I try to bring in creativity in the academic writing is to focus on the sort of the story I want to tell. And you can't always do this with certain like journals, for example, because they have an expected structure of the journal where it's, you know, background methods and things like that. So I try to bring that in a bit more creative by, like, for instance, introducing the case study early. Or, you know, the other thing I like to do is add suspense. So I always put the results towards the end, right? And so people are like, well, what's the answer? What's the answer? And try to bring that in a little bit, things like that. A little creativity there. I'm more creative in presentations. I get a little bit more fun in presentations, and some academic presentations, I don't even talk about what I did at all. I just talk about the problems and the literature and the story and how the outcomes contribute to that story. Yeah. Yeah, Jim.
So going to a volume of the document, the size of the document, you had referenced in your slides, professional, you're trying to persuade, and academic, you really want to influence the new understanding of the topic. So coming from professional like I was, in fact, evaluated on volume, because anything that was less than, say, 20, 30 pages could possibly be persuasive. It's just not deep enough. And I wrote a lot of governmental policy documents that had to be a certain minimum page count to be considered real. Going to academia, carrying that forward, I'm finding I'm adding the same volume by simply expanding my bibliography, my reference file, and putting more and more and more in to match the perceived page count. And yet that's not, as we talked about when we started, that's not what you think should be done. And I'm struggling to reduce my concept in academic writing to not just keep adding reference, to bulk it up and knowing when to stop. Can you comment on how you know in academics when things are long enough versus professional when they really need to be long to be considered valid?
Yeah. So for those online, in case you couldn't hear Jim, if I paraphrase, the question is really about
already you're summarizing. There you go.
the volume of of literature or the volume of the document, like how much do you have to write in order to really be, perhaps considered academic versus considered professional? And are there any guidance on terms of finding that balance between length and elements there? I actually don't have a good answer for that. Like I have my own personal preference that, I prefer to see shorter papers and shorter responses that have a good depth of knowledge, meaning that you're making those connections with references and those points. Like Dr. Miller had a nice paragraph that was really quite deep in her presentation. It had several citations that brought in several concepts. You could have written that as 3 or 4 paragraphs independently to broaden that, and you might do that like in a professional one because you're adding breadth to the depth of the paper to show that we did work. But I tend to steer more towards those short, concise, strong references, and you let the other literature bring in that volume, right? So somebody else, Scott and Miller, wrote, a 10-page journal article that talked about this. I'm going to reference it. I'm then bringing in that depth. I don't need to continue and add to that. So that's my own personal preference, but I would go back to primarily think of the audience. Yeah, so who's reading are going to be really reading that paper, and what are some of those expectations? So some conference papers will have very short expectations, and that conference attendees are going to be reading these papers. So the volume there might suggest to be only 3 or 4 pages, maybe 5 pages long. Journal articles tend to be a little bit longer, 6,000 to 8,000 words. From there, final project reports for classes, they might be 10,000, 20,000 words, right? Because you're adding in additional depth to explore that. But yeah, that's probably my guidance, is to think strictly on the audience. But I don't have a good answer to that. Does anybody have online or any thoughts to volume considerations?
I had an idea. This is Stahl, by the way. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Stahl, go ahead.
Yes. I was thinking that as far as volume, having it to be concise as long as you're telling the complete story, that always seems to work for me when I read papers. I think the difference between something that's longer and something that's shorter while still telling a story is that you can get through more papers faster. That definitely helps in learning. So that's what I would comment on.
That's a good point. Yeah. I actually have some peer writers that I write with, and I have them read my stuff. And one person I work with at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories can somehow manage to say what I just said in 65% of the words. And so I always send it to Jennifer and say, Jennifer, here, I said this, and she'll send it back to me. And I'm like, oh, it says exactly the same thing, and it still is neutral and still has all these great expressions, but it's much shorter. How did you so some people are really good at that. Oops, sorry. I'm probably not that good. I'll probably be really long, and I have to spend a lot of time trying to be concise at the end, because I end up being very verbose and repetitive and stuff. And then I edit quite a bit until it's good there. Yeah. Other questions? Oh yeah, there is quite a bit. Thanks. Let's see here. Just sharing the presentations, procedural things. Yeah, all the presentations and information will be available afterwards for sure. Yeah.
So I had a quick question.
Yeah, Cody.
So I think one of my hardest things to do, and you kind of touched on it, but when you get your introduction, you kind of at least articulate, because I'm not a very strong writer, but when you articulate, here's what I'm trying to add to the community or demonstrate in this paper. How do you transition from the individual concepts that then build on your whole idea? I always have a hard time, because I'm like, oh, there's this piece that was really good, and now there's this piece, and I always have a really hard time, I guess, cohesively tying everything together, and I'm not sure the best way to go about doing that.
Oh, okay. Now, so Cody, maybe I'll address a couple different thoughts there. One is tying together the broader structure of the paper, or what you're writing, and tying together individual paragraphs, or even just transitioning from, I was talking about the broad literature and what's happening in the realm, and now I want to transition to where I can talk about what I've done. So I guess there's all those different layers of transitions. So on the broad, like the whole overall paper transition, the best way to do that is to do a simple sentence outline, like a structure outline, where you just write the first topic sentence of your paper beforehand, and it gives you a bit of a guideline, because then you can start to see, do you have a big gap between talking about the literature and methods, right? And so if you do have those gaps, then you would add in another paragraph or some sort of transitional element to help smooth that through. But if you're trying to transition from the broader literature to your own individual work, a couple stylistic tools that you can use are just focus strictly on those transitional sentences. So and so said this, and this is a challenge that we have. There's opportunity to address this. Consequently, in my study, I will explore this particular element of the broader discipline, right? And so you can and then once you made that transition to yourself, then you can continue with like what you've done or where you're going through there. So those, I mean, it doesn't have to be significant. It doesn't have to be multiple paragraphs. We can really do a very fast transition, usually at the end of a paragraph, or if it's a good topic sentence paragraph, to do that. But don't be afraid to be very direct and saying that they have. But key is making sure that you reference back to the original topic and then how you are specifically going to expand on it. Hope that helps a little bit, Cody.
No, it does. Yeah, I think it's just I get tracked on like one thing and then I don't know how to properly switch. That's a good way to directly, like you said, be pretty direct and just say, here's where I'm at and here's where I'm going.
Yeah, I love consequently, subsequently, therefore, likewise, or all those kind of those are pretty good transition words that can really help you just switch 180 degrees around, and you can talk about something different, as long as you still reference back a little bit to what you were going to talk about. Okay. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I just want to thank everybody for listening to me ramble a little bit. And hopefully this will be helpful for you to start your journey, or to think about where you are in your journey, or to find some references on that particular thing. I think I caught all the questions that we have. So again, thank you very much. And for those that are working on the PhD elements, we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks. Thanks so much.